Hello everyone, and welcome to another live presentation here on my channel. Today I'm going to be working with some velaturas. I'm going to be working on this portrait. I want to talk a little bit about what are velaturas and thin layers in oil painting. This is a technique that goes back to the Renaissance when artists were working with handmade pigments and handmade grounds. So I'm going to be recreating this technique for you guys today. For a lot of you that are joining and are interested in asking questions, you're welcome to post your questions on the comments section, and I'll be happy to answer any questions that you may have. I recommend that you post the questions at the end of the live presentation because it'll go smoother that way. So let's just begin by telling you a little bit about my palette. This is a traditional palette used by pretty much all the oil masters from prior to the 19th century. It's a palette that is very rich with earth pigments, and you have some of the other not so popular pigments such as the madder lake. This is a pigment that is not used today. This pigment has been replaced by alizarin crimson, and also the vermilion, which is a pigment that has been replaced by the cadmium red. For a lot of you at home that are interested in recreating a lot of these techniques, you could replace these pigments with perhaps cadmium red medium, or cadmium red light, and alizarin crimson. Now, the modern substitutes are not the same as the traditional pigments. You have, pigments that are synthesized in a lab, and basically they behave in a very different way. So that's why I'm always using these pigments to sort of recreate these techniques, because they do make a big difference when you're working with some of the particle sizes and things like that, which I'm going to be getting into all of that. Also the lead white, you notice here that I have two types of lead white. This is something that I recently discovered in a lot of the manuscripts and also the scientific journals, and it's that the old masters used sometimes two types of lead white. I discovered this through my studies of Vermeer, and he seems to have used a different type of lead white in the top layers, and by processing the stack process lead white in different ways, you could achieve a more transparent lead white. So that's an experiment that I'm working with today. Also, let's just go ahead and talk a little bit about the earth pigments. So this is yellow ochre, golden yellow ochre, Venetian red, and brown ochre. If you follow my channel, you've probably seen this in a lot of my short videos, and I always mention this color because it's very useful. It was found in a lot of paintings by Rembrandt and Vermeer. And finally, I have here bone black. This is a beautiful black that is kind of neutral. You could go cool with cool mixtures. Also, if you bring a little bit of the red lake with the bone black, or even the brown ochre, you could warm up those grays. So in terms of the sequence of the painting here, I've built up this painting with just 4 colors: lead white, stack process lead white, yellow ochre, red ochre, and black. So what you see here has just been built up in 2-3 layers with just those colors, and using complementaries in terms of the green and the red. So I just harmonized the color using complements. You could use also grays, grisaille to do this. I find that the grisaille was used by a lot of the old masters, but I don't really like the grisaille because it tends to make the color too cool. So you could opt to do this in any way that you desire. There certainly isn't any rules that I've observed in paintings from the past. It seems like different masters had different methods. So let's see, I have a question or perhaps a comment from Sentient Tent. Thank you for joining. Yes, the bone black indeed is a beautiful, beautiful black, and you could also use lamp black. You could use Mars black, lamp black, vine black. So these are just a whole array of different shades, and you get different grays. The lamp black tends to go on the cooler side, so it's up to you. If you're going to mix greens with yellow ochre and black, then perhaps the lamp black will give you a stronger green. So just be aware of that. But in some chemical analysis and some cross sections from scientific journals, I always tend to find the same palette in the top layers. That is vermilion, yellow ochre, or red ochre, red lake, and some sort of black or blue. That seems to be, and of course, everything mixed with the lead white. So the velaturas, what is velaturas? So the velatura is essentially a translucent layer. A lot of students confuse transparent with translucent. Translucent means that you could kind of see through it. It's a veil, and I'm going to make a demonstration here. So I'm using, by the way, sun thickened oil, and I'm going to mix it here with my stack process lead white. And as you can see, this is a translucent color or translucent mixture, right? You could kind of see through it, but it has a little bit of opacity, okay? And that's what we're going to be doing today. That's what the velatura technique involves. You want to use pigments that are translucent, finely ground pigments. The old masters ground the pigments with water to be able to achieve this prior to mixing them with oil or molding them with oil. And this yields a very, very fine particle size, and you're able to create these very beautiful translucent colors to create subtlety in your paintings. So that's essentially what the technique of velatura is. You're putting translucent top layers. So let's just go ahead and get started here with some mixtures. And what I want to do is I want to soften some of these tints and create richer colors. So I'm going to go ahead and mix vermilion with stack process lead white. And I'm also going to bring in just a tiny bit of black. Okay, this is just to kind of neutralize. Let's just mix a little bit of a gray here. And I'm also going to bring in a little bit of yellow just to get this very soft green. Now, what's the complement of red? Green, right? So you get this very soft shade. And this is important because you could go gray with this, black and white, or you could go green, black, yellow ochre, and white. So be careful with the black. As you can see, the black could destroy the mixture and it could make it too gray. So it's also the sequence. If you mix the yellow ochre and the black first, you get green, and then if you mix white into it, of course, you're going to get a really nice, beautiful green shade. So this is going to neutralize your vermilion white lead mixture. So, and what I want to do is I want to just demonstrate here in this area of the light. Now, prior to doing this, there's two ways that you could achieve this. You could do seco, which means you apply the color directly on the dry surface, a paint layer that has already dried, or you could do wet into wet, as the Spaniards call this, untado, which is you're going to spread a little bit of medium, in this case, sun thickened oil. And the Italian painters such as Cennino Cennini mentioned sun thickened oil as being superior to the heat bodied oil. I mentioned this before. And then you could put a few drops of spike oil or turpentine to make this a little bit leaner. But this is already my last layer, so I'm just going to spread this very, very thin veil of color, of oil on this layer, just so I get a very nice flow and the color just spreads really nicely, and it sort of gets integrated with the first layer. So I'm going to go ahead and start applying my velatura. And I want to be careful here. I mix some general colors, but I don't want to go too opaque too quickly. I just want to test out the color. And I just want to apply, and again, even the camera will not probably be able to pick up these very subtle layers that I'm applying, because they're translucent veils of white. Now the glaze, what is the difference between a glaze and a velatura? The velatura has lead white. The glaze would be, for example, if you apply just raw umber, in this case brown ochre, let's just apply a very thin layer of brown ochre on the shadow side, and it has no white. So this would be considered a glaze, and it's perfect to create a warmth passage right here, which I will need. Okay. And these are very subtle layers. These are the top layers. You probably don't want to do this in the first layers because you don't have enough body on there, enough paint to build up subtlety. So let's just go back to the light. And again, just talking shop here, let's talk a little bit about the pigments. Some of these lead whites were ground with vinegar and ground with water. First ground with vinegar, then ground with water, to get a very, very beautiful translucent, as you can see here. It's a very translucent stack process lead white. This is a very different technique than perhaps Rembrandt or a lot of the masters from the 17th century that were using very thick lead white. This is quite the opposite. So you are going to grind the lead white to a beautiful fineness, maybe 1 or 2 hours on the stone or your glass slab, and you get a gorgeous color to create these beautiful subtleties. Okay. And for example, I want to create a transition there. Very, very subtle transition. So I'm going to go back with my green because I want the transitions to just be very soft. And because I have oil on the surface, of course, you don't want to let the oil drip down. This is important because if you have, perhaps you could use liquid. This is a modern material that you could use, but sun thickened oil does not beat up. A lot of times when you oil out, you'll get beating up, and the sun thickened oil does not, especially if you put a few drops of solvent. So you get a really nice integration of that first layer and some beautiful transitions. So I just want to soften this area. There was a jump, too harsh of a jump there. And I'm just gonna, by the way, I'm using one of my favorite brushes to use, which is, this is Isabey Petit Gris. Is in my kit, which is in the description below. You could find out some of the materials that I use by visiting that link. So let's just go ahead and create some subtle transitions here. And you could start by applying these very subtle passages, and if you need to bring impasto, you could switch to impasto if you need to. But I'm interested in getting a lot of the subtlety. It's a female portrait. This is a portrait of my lovely wife, and I want to get the subtlety on her face, right? Also, you could even use it to create softer transitions here. For example, I want to create a softer transition here. So by applying these very thin velaturas, you're really getting a nice sense of rich color, subtlety. And let's just go with this. This is a finer lead white. It was finely ground. This is finely ground, but this is even finer. So I alternate between the two, depending on what I'm doing here. So, and again, you could get fancy with any of these techniques, depending on what you want to achieve with your own work. So I'm applying the velatura here to create a softer transition between that highlight. I want the highlight to kind of, you could do it by mixing an opaque transition, but the velatura just makes it a little bit easier to get to adjust some of those subtleties. It's a very beautiful thin veil of color that is just going to smooth everything. So I'm just creating the soft transitions. Now the under layers are built up with red ochre, and the red ochre is not as intense or as bright as or as pink as the vermilion. So this is a technique that they employed. It's actually cooler, so you get a vibration between the cool color of the red ochre underneath and the warmer velatura of the vermilion on top, especially if you mix it with the yellow ochre. So this is important to take all this into account as you're working, because these techniques were designed they're engineered to, well, essentially solve problems in painting. You have if you're working with very highly opaque paint, it's very difficult to get extremely subtle transitions. So by using a velatura, you could build up the layers and create a visual, well, I would call it's almost like a puzzle, essentially, of many pieces of paint that are coming together. It's almost like Photoshop. For a lot of you that use Photoshop, you have all these colors side by side. So the velatura sort of works like that as well, except that we have the added bonus that it gives us space. Velatura is going to go on top, and the underneath layers are going to be behind, so you're getting actual space from the velatura. This is a concept that is not well understood by alla prima painters. If you're doing a lot of alla prima painting and you're just used to working with one layer of paint, well, this would be a strange concept. But for the old masters, and for a lot of you that are joining, I want to invite you to check out my courses on Vermeer and Rembrandt. I also have the videos available here on the channel, and you'll be able to see, link up to some of the chemical analysis, the technical analysis that they've used to figure out some of the techniques. And you'll see that these old masters were using multiple layers to achieve these effects, the top layers being the thinnest. So for example, here is obviously two. I have to clean my brush there. By the way, using the squirrel hair brushes is probably one of the best methods to achieve this. You're not going to really be able to achieve this with a bristle brush. The bristle brush is good to spread the medium and to perhaps do a broad glaze in the background, but to get these very subtle effects, most manuscripts recommend either sable brushes, which I also have a sable brush here, or the squirrel hair brushes, which I find superior for applying the velatura. But that's up to you. I mean, a lot of artists prefer the sables, but the squirrel hair just tends to, I don't know, it's strange, the how the paint is applied. It goes on there very differently than a sable brush. So you see here how those transitions now are a lot more subtle. The camera, I don't know if it could pick them up, but so I could spend hours and hours and hours. Now, I want to tell you a little information about the oil. Italian manuscripts recommend a sun-thickened oil, and northern manuscripts recommend a heat-bodied oil. This is a heat-bodied oil. Okay, this is walnut heat-bodied oil. This oil has been heated or cooked with litharge and glass, and this is a superb dryer. Now, if I were to oil out with this, some manuscripts from the north recommend to mix this with turpentine and to oil out with this medium. In my situation, I live in the tropics, and basically this painting would be dry in about 2 hours time. So I don't get much working time if I use the dryers, so that's why I'm using the sun-thickened oil. That's a very neat detail. I mean, you have manuscripts that describe the sun-thickened oils, which probably is because of the warm weather in the Mediterranean, versus the northern countries that are using the heat-bodied oils. And it's a really neat detail. When you're using these materials, you get to learn why perhaps they were used. Here in the tropics, if I use a dryer, this painting will be dry in 3 hours time. I have to right now have AC in my studio, because basically if not, the paint will dry in 2 hours time, and I won't get the working time. So this is important. All right, let's continue here to get more subtlety. And especially here and around the chin, let's just mix a little bit more yellow ochre. Now, you want to use a medium that is non-yellowing also, because you don't want this to yellow all over the place. I mean, if you're using an oil that has not been washed properly, I mean, I wouldn't try this using a yellowing oil such as cold pressed linseed oil or something like that. The oil does have to be processed, and refined. Let's see, I have a question. Is Stan oil the same thing as heat thickened linseed oil? Well, Stan oil is a modern concept. The old-fashioned Stan oil is essentially oil that is just left to stand and thicken. So if you have oil that essentially sits in a cup for 2 months, 3 months, and it'll get thick like honey. That's the old-fashioned Stan oil. Nowadays, they make the Stan oil, I believe it's in the absence of oxygen or in a vacuum seal, and this prevents the oil from yellowing. Modern Stan oil is a superior method to the old, obviously the old heat-bodied oil. The old heat-thickened oil is essentially oil that has been heated with a dryer, such as litharge, red lead, or leaded glass, okay? Or sometimes the combination of the three, okay? This oil results in a dark, if you're cooking linseed oil, it results in a very dark oil. And I don't like to use it for oiling out. If I oil out, I will oil out with the heat-bodied walnut oil. This oil, the walnut oil, doesn't seem to darken as much. Obviously, because it's a less yellowing oil than linseed oil, okay? So that's important. But I prefer the sun thickened oil. I do have a recommendation for a lot of you that are joining. If you're interested in finding out more about the linseed oil that I'm using, check out the mediums. I think the video is called Historic Mediums. And it's a video that explores essentially all the techniques used to refine the oil. And I mentioned there the Pacheco oil, which is the oil that I'm using. It's a solvent. Well, he uses alcohol, and that seems to be the best type of sun thickened oil that I've used. For whatever reason, I'm sure the science behind is pretty amazing. I don't really know. I will be honest. I don't really know the entire science behind the purification of linseed oil with ethanol. I do know that it has solvent properties, and he's also using the spike lavender flowers, which are really amazing. Spike lavender is an amazing plant. There's a lot of beautiful properties. People are using it for aromatherapy and all sorts of things. So I use it as a solvent because it's not as toxic as the turpentine. Although some people are allergic to it, you do have to be careful. You have to be very careful with the spike oil. Some people have allergic reactions. I do not, but if you experience some allergic reactions with the spike oil, just be aware that you have to discontinue its use. So here I'm just creating a lot more subtlety. And let's see, I have another question from Mahmoud. Let's see. Thank you for joining. What is William Bouguereau's technique for creating a sense of smoke, softness, and smooth transitions? Well, I have not copied any William Bouguereau's, but from what I've read, I do believe he's using Velaturas as well. And this is a technique that goes back to Leonardo. Leonardo essentially developed this technique. By using very thin velaturas, you could get some very soft transitions. So I do know that he used some 19th century mediums that I'll have to do research on that one. Not well versed with Bouguereau. I don't really follow 19th century techniques because 19th century techniques are really just an extension of the old techniques developed by the Baroque masters and Renaissance masters. So I just rather go to the source. If you look at a painter like Jacques-Louis David, he's using an ébauche, which is essentially an underpainting in Italian, brown, and then he just builds up with a grisaille, and then from there he's doing velatura. Well, Leonardo was doing that, and Vermeer was doing that. So it's good to go back to the source with a lot of these masters. So, but yeah, I mean, there's a wealth of information online that I highly recommend if you're interested in, because I do see here on YouTube a lot of artists recreating techniques, and they don't use the historical pigments. I mean, I could tell you, and I could attest, guys, I woke up at 6 o'clock this morning to make this palette, okay? This palette is all handmade paints, and I tried to use the historical pigments to kind of see what you get in terms of techniques. So if you're using cadmium red from the store that has a luminous stearate, or alizarin crimson, well, you're not going to probably get a lot of these subtleties. I mean, you'll get subtleties that are inherent to that material, but if you're trying to discover how the old pigments behave, well, there's not really any better way than just to use that in the demonstrations, right? So that's what I try to do here in my channel, and try to recreate some of the techniques using to best of my ability, right, the traditional pigments, because they do make a difference. I mean, this is an important factor when you're trying to figure out if the vermilion behaves in a different way. Here I'm creating a lot more subtlety. There was too much of a jump there, so I've used the velatura to adjust that value. So one of the things that I encourage students and artists, other artists, is to do material explorations. I know that a lot of artists do not believe in that nowadays. They're much too lazy to grind pigments and prepare oils, but the materials do make a fundamental difference in the effects that you achieve. So you can see here, I'm just smoothing out a lot of those jumps with the velaturas, and you could achieve this also through opaque mixtures, by creating an opacity and then mixing it, obviously creating a transition, and you could do that. But the visual aspect of the painting is not the same. You don't get that. It's difficult to explain, but the painting doesn't have it. When you go to the 19th century wing at any museum, the paintings look very opaque versus, going to Renaissance galleries where the paintings, you can see that there's depth, a lot of depth in the paint layers, and it's because of velatura. They use a velatura. So let's continue here. Again, I want to I want to thank everyone for joining. I know that a lot of you follow me on here on YouTube, but if you haven't discovered my other social media, such as my TikTok channel, my Instagram, I'm always posting short videos there. So I want to invite you to check out those links in the description below. Also, for a lot of you that are interested in perhaps going in depth into a lot of these techniques and creating a framework, I've set up all these videos on the Udemy server. You could find those links in the description below, and they give you sort of a more holistic vision of what it is I'm trying to do, especially with sort of going back to the source of learning how the old masters use layers to create subtlety. I talk about that in my drawing courses, and then I also have the recreation of some of the techniques from Rembrandt and Vermeer. So I want to invite you all to check out those links below. And again, thank you for joining. Let's see, I have a question from Marina Sanchez Montero, and I'm going to switch to Spanish for my viewers that are joining me from Latin America. ¿Puedo usar la esencia de lavanda como la trementina? ¿Sirve, por ejemplo, para hacer graso sobre magro? ¿Por qué la esencia de lavanda sigue siendo un aceite o hay otro tipo de producto de lavanda? El tipo de aceite de lavanda que estoy utilizando se llama espliego. Los españoles le dicen espliego. En Latinoamérica no es lo mismo que el aceite de lavanda. Tienes que tener cuidado si compras aceite de lavanda, especialmente si ha sido adulterado, ¿okay?, con otros materiales. Y el aceite de espliego viene de la mata o sea, la planta de espliego, que es familia de la lavanda, pero no es lo mismo. Se llama, déjame buscarlo aquí, mira. Este es el aceite que estoy utilizando, se llama lavandula latifiola, ¿ok? 100% puro, este es el aceite. También puedes utilizar el aceite de lavanda. Esto es aceite de lavanda y aceite de espliego. ¿Cuál es la diferencia? Este se seca mejor. Este se seca un poquito más despacio y te puede dar resultados buenos, pero yo prefiero el aceite de espliego, ¿ok? La trementina es más tóxica que este aceite. De hecho, este aceite lo usan para aromaterapia. Mi recomendación es que utilices aceite de espliego y no uses trementina, porque la trementina en un estudio cerrado puede ser muy tóxico. ¿Okay? Así que eso es la diferencia. Lo puedes conseguir en Etsy. Yo consigo el mío en Etsy a través de una señora que tiene un negocio en Etsy y es magnífico el aceite de lavanda. Me ha resultado espectacular, especialmente hay uno que es de Chelsea Products, no lo compro, no sé por qué, es muy fuerte. El de Natural Pigments y el de Chelsea me dan dolor de cabeza. Entonces no sé si es que pues le ponen otros aditivos. Le puedes escribir a estos otros negocios y ver si ellos le ponen aditivos, pero el que a mí no me da dolor de cabeza es este, ¿ok? Porque dice aquí 100% puro y obviamente pues eso es lo que tú quieres. Hay un video espectacular en un canal que quiero recomendarte, que es creo que el apellido del señor es Monesma, es un español que tiene documentado estos procesos de cómo en los tiempos de antes extraían el aceite de lavanda. Y es un video muy, muy instructivo en el sentido que puedes aprender un poquito más de ese material. Eso lo puedes conseguir en el canal de él. Creo que es Manuel Monesma. Ok, gracias por unirte, by the way, a mi canal y sintonizar aquí gracias. Tengo aquí otro. I have another question from Juan José Trigo. Juan José, muchas gracias por unirte. Gracias Luis por el español, muy valioso para algunos de nosotros. Gracias Manuel, gracias José, perdóname, por unirte aquí al directo, te lo aprecio mucho. So we're going to continue. So you can see here how I'm applying these very thin veils, and now I'm getting a lot more subtlety. What I want to do is, for example, here in the nose, the transitions here are very, very subtle. So I want to continue with the application of these very, very thin veils using yellow ochre and vermilion, which is the standard mixture that you see in a lot of these chemical analysis, cross sections. That seems to be the go-to mixture. Now, there is a material that is used by Vermeer, and it's the Red Lake. He uses Red Lake, yellow ochre, black in the first layers. And let me show you how you could use the Red Lake. So by mixing Red Lake and lead white, you get a cooler mixture. Now try this with alizarin crimson. You won't be able to get this shade, guaranteed. I tried it a million times, and look at what a beautiful pink you get here. It's a lot more subtle. It's not Pepto-Bismol like the modern alizarin crimson, which I really do not like. I mean, I'll use it from time to time, but so I have a question here from Ben. Let's see. This is the spike oil. Let's see. Uncanic brand. Probably, let's see if you can see it there. No, it's out of focus. So this is Uncanic, UNCANOONUC. This comes from Canada, and it's a wonderful, wonderful spike oil. I've used it. It's 100% pure, and I'm in love with it. I really enjoy it. I want to say hello to my dear wife that's joining. She's here joining us also on the chat. So just want to say hello to her. Thank you for posting, and thank you for always posting those beautiful ads for us and all those wonderful promos that she does for our school. So let's see. Let's continue here. Let's try to mix this is another popular mixture. So the vermilion with the red lake and also lead white to get some of the brighter shades. And in this case, probably gonna use the brighter shade here on the tip of the nose and also on the lips, a velatura on the lips. Now on the other side of the lip, I'm going to use the red lake and a little bit of black. This is a popular mixture, and this is just to get more depth. So by mixing, now this would be considered a glaze. As soon as I bring white into it, it will transform it into a velatura. So by mixing white into the two prior mixtures, let's bring a little bit of black. And you see this mixture, this is probably one of the most popular mixtures in all of the old master paintings. I mean, Rembrandt used this, Caravaggio, Velázquez, red lake with bone black and a little bit of lead white, and they used this to paint shadow passages, and subtlety in the cheeks. I mean, it's everywhere. So that's what I'm doing here. I'm applying a very thin velatura, and I want to get that transition. Now you could spend hours and hours and hours creating these very soft and also getting the soft edges. There you can see how that shade just became a lot brighter, but it's not as overpowering. So let's just go ahead and move a little bit. Let's see, let's move to the eye, which a lot of you probably are interested in seeing how the velatura works with the eye. So let's just go ahead and create a nice subtle transition here into the shadow. Okay. By using all these tricks and techniques, you could get uncanny subtlety in your work. In some of the chemical analysis of paintings by Leonardo and other masters from the Renaissance, they find multiple velaturas. So for example, I want to create more subtlety here. To do this, I recommend lead white. I mean, a lot of you that are not using lead white and are using perhaps titanium white, it's more difficult because it's a lot more opaque. So you could still do it by mixing chalk into the titanium white. You could get a lot more subtlety, but the lead white is probably the best material to use for this technique. So now I want to get a nice, subtle, very bright transition between the dark, the shadow mask, and the light mask along the top of the bridge of the nose. So I'm going to mix yellow ochre with a little bit of red ochre. Excuse me, this is Venetian red from Kramer Pigments. I love Kramer Pigments. I usually buy my pigments from, my raw pigments from Kramer. And I'll tell you a little secret about Kramer Pigments. He provides pigments that are not finely ground, so you can manipulate them. Meaning that the first layers of this painting were not so finely ground. That's where you get the textures. And then the top layers are very finely ground. If you're using a tube of paint, you can't do that because they give you a standardized product that is all finely ground. So that's why a lot of students and a lot of the subscribers say, well, why do you waste your time grinding paints? It's a waste of time. That's why, because you don't have that type of control if you use commercial materials versus creating your own materials and grinding the paint, in different to different particle sizes. So Kramer pigments will give you pigments that are not finely ground, and then you could grind them down yourself with water or using a ball mill. You could also use levitation, which means that you grind the pigment and you put it in a cup of water, and then the top pigments, the pigments that are floating in the water, you decant, and then you do particle selection that way. This is a very important aspect of this technique, okay? I have a question here. Let's see, the Stoic Apple, thank you for joining. It's in your Rembrandt video, you use orange ochre. By the way, I've fallen in love with the pigment. Sometimes I like using it for skin tones instead of Venetian red. I'd love to hear your thoughts on how they compare. Yes, orange ochre is a beautiful pigment. I don't use it, and the reason is because I get a really nice orange from the mixture of Venetian. This is Kramer Venetian red and Kramer golden ochre, and I get this. Let me just show you here. This is a gorgeous orange that I get, and I find it more high key than the orange ochre. Look at this. I mean, this is a very high key color. You could, somewhat, not compared to vermilion, but this mixture is really beautiful. So by using these two, I could get that orange ochre, and it's actually brighter. Why do I prefer this Venetian red from Kramer? It's just higher key than perhaps a lot of the other ochres out there. So I really like it. But yeah, the orange ochre, it does have some beautiful, all the ochres, even the brown ochre here is just a gorgeous color. Let's just go ahead and use the the brown ochre, just to show you what a gorgeous color is for glazing. So for example, if I wanted to do a glaze with this brown ochre, is very transparent, very beautiful. It's an amazing dryer. As a matter of fact, I have to kind of activate it here because it dries very quickly. So it's perfect for glazing shadows, and I can see why they use it. And it doesn't dry flat like a raw umber, for example. A lot of artists use raw umber to glaze, and the glazing with the raw umber is just too. Look at this. I could soften that edge by just bringing that over the edge and softening the transition. So of course you got to manipulate it. You can't leave it like that. So I'm using a brush that is, it's a script liner, and I use this to soften edges. This is made out of squirrel hair as well. And now I've just softened that edge with just a very subtle glaze. You see that in the old master paintings. You see that they manipulate edges quite a bit. And if I want to cool it off because it's too warm, all I got to do is just bring in the black, and it turns into a color closer to raw umber. So you get a lot of manipulation ways to manipulate these colors. So for example, I want to push this, do a glaze there. To push this back, I could do a glaze with the brown ochre. And of course, you could just soften that. And so these are techniques that you could employ in your own work. Let's just do a little subtle glaze here using that same strategy there, just to push this a little bit darker and disappear this edge. Sometimes that's probably one of the most difficult things for students, is that you want to do edge control. So I want to disappear that edge there. I have an edge there, and it rotates and it disappears. So you could do that with a glaze, a very subtle glaze. Okay. So the same thing here in the tip of the nose. I want to push this plane. I want to darken this plane, but I don't want to mix the color opaquely. Not yet. So I just use a glaze to push this back. Now you could theoretically work the glaze in combination with the velatura. So if I want to make this more opaque, I just drop some opaque color in there with my mixtures, my regular mixtures. Okay, I have a question here from Rob125. Thank you for joining. Is it possible to glaze cast shadows, or do you just paint cast shadows with opaque paints, please? Absolutely. Absolutely. You could, I mean, cast shadows, if there is one passage of paintings that the old masters glaze, it's cast shadows. I mean, you could build up the cast shadow in black and white and then glaze it with umber or with brown ochre or with, you know, any other mixture. You probably, I mean, you could even do velatura into the glaze to create different effects, especially if you're doing the penumbra, which is the, you know, the lighter part of the cast shadow. So yeah, absolutely, you could do that. So for example, here I want to soften this area and warm it up. So I could just do this very, very subtle glaze, and this will just go on for hours and hours and hours. Again, the concept that I'm bringing here, forth this concept that was well used by painters from the past, is that, I mean, just for example, I could glaze. Let me just show you. While we're at it, I could just glaze this shadow, right? This is a glaze with brown ochre and my sun thickened oil. So now I'm glazing that shadow. Now, I don't usually like to leave the glazes untouched, meaning I will go back in with a velatura into the dark glaze. This is a technique many years ago, well, in 2019, I traveled to Italy, and there was a beautiful exhibition of Tintoretto on view in El Palazzo Ducale, and I was able to observe these amazing use of velatura within the shadow masses. So meaning you have a passage like this, and then you could come in with very subtle velatura. Let's just bring in some of the green from the background in there. So I'm going to mix my yellow ochre, my black, and a little bit of umber, which is a shadow color. Excuse me, the brown ochre. And then I could just drop some velatura into that to integrate the background into the color of the background into the shadow. And this is a common technique used by Tintoretto. You see this in Titian. But mostly this technique comes from the north. This is a Flemish technique developed by painters from the north, and it finds its way into Venetian painters, mostly Florentine artists. Venetian painters started to work more opaquely in a style that is similar to perhaps Impressionism, but not quite. They were still glazing shadows and glazing colors, but the lights were painted more opaquely. But they still use velatura. So for example, if I want to push my reflective light and I have a warmth in the shadow, now I want to bring cool into the reflective light, which is coming from the background, I could even bring a little bit of red into that mixture to get a subtle reflective light. And now the shadow's a lot more subtle and the color is not as harsh. So these are ways that you could finish a painting. Imagine, of course, these live presentations. They're meant to sort of bring forth these techniques and give you, an overall idea of the techniques employed by some of these masters. There's no way that I could, spend here 3 hours. That would be probably about the limit that most of you probably don't even have the time to spend three hours here. But I do wanted to bring this technique forth for a lot of you that are following my channel and that are constantly writing and commenting on my social media. I want to thank everyone for joining my social media and following my channel. I hope you've enjoyed this presentation. Let's see, do I have any other questions? No. So again, I want to invite everyone to join my social media, Instagram channel, TikTok, Facebook. You could find some information also on the Atelier School website, and some of the videos are available on Udemy. So again, I want to invite everyone to join, and I will see you next time with another live presentation. Thank you for joining.